Dobrý den, tak já bych vás poprosil, jestli si můžete postupně posedat. Začneme. Já vás tady vítám na 7. MeetUpu ve firmě Valeo a rovnou předám slovo panu Matějovi Kostlímu, který nám o Valeu něco řekne.
Tak, dobrý den, ještě jednou teda jsme rádi, že jste tu. Thank you very much for coming here. I'm sorry, this meetup will be in English because there are some not Czech speakers, so therefore we will have it in English, even the presentations and the slides. Allow me to welcome you here at this event in our R&D center. For those who are here for the first time on our meetups, you are in our R&D center of Valeo. Valeo is a global company, tier one supplier in automotive. We have over 100,000 employees globally, and we have many R&D centers like this all over the world. In here, it is very crucial and specific R&D center for the purpose of development of so-called advanced driving assistance systems. We have technologies and develop technologies here that lead to the autonomous driving. These technologies, for those who have attended some of the meetups we have and held in the past, you already know that for the purpose of validating and testing of these systems, often new approaches are taken. Some of them include virtual validation and even the use of game development engines and so on. For this purpose, I'm actually happy that we are here today because we can present what are the technologies and trends that are used for testing and validation in automotive. Such Valeo is recording a lot of data. Valeo has to run a lot of tests to validate all the sensors and the functions before any car can go on the streets with these systems, and therefore these have to be validated and tested. For these are used often the methods in virtual space, and we will learn more about these. I will not take any longer of your time with my speech here, so just once again, thank you very much for coming. And we will have two presentations today. One of them will be delivered by Valeo, my colleague. The other one will be held by Jaroslav Přivánek, who is an associate professor at from Charles University, Department of Mathematics and Physics. So I'm sure we will have a lot of interesting presentations ahead. So thank you very much. And first speaker, Valeo.
Good afternoon, also from my side. Yeah, so I hope that you can hear me now. Just a minute. Hello, 1, 2, 3. I'll check. Okay, so. Okay. Hello. So, good afternoon once again. My name is Valeo, and I'm from the R&D Center here from Prague, from Valeo. And I will show you in the next, let's say, 30 to 40 minutes what methods we are using for ground truth extraction, which is mainly my focus because I'm the software team leader for the ground truth extraction team here in Valeo. And I will also show you what, let's say, link does it have for virtual validation, what in high level virtual validation is, and yeah, after that you will have a break and you will see later more interesting things from my colleague here. Please, this is meetup session. So if you will have any questions, feel free to interrupt me. I have several options in the presentation to like speed it up or go to more details, so we don't have to. I can edit the time. So. Have you seen a Pixar movie, Inside Out, in Czech, Valeo? It's a quite interesting movie, I think 3-4 years old. And it's about a real girl which has small characters in her head, and those characters represent different emotions. And they are controlling her behavior. Who has seen that? This is actually quite an interesting thing, because this is one of the first movies which is working with, let's say, latest research results of the behavioral psychology. And there are several concepts which are, of course, presented in like children form, but they are not very far from how the psychologists today believe that our behavior is controlled. I will show you a video of a similar thing, how we can imagine that autonomous car works. So this is an advertisement of Audi on their, let's say, like this autonomous driving system. And I will show you this because I want to, let's say, set up the context to like show you how the autonomous cars today can work, what are the main functions. And after that, I will also show you, explaining how this links to data validation.
All sensors, take this mission. Commander? All right, let's do this. Everybody ready? This is our time to shine. We're picking up a parking command on the app. Let's welcome our driver. Top UCAM, what have you got for me?
Top UCAM online.
Ultrasound crew?
There's an obstacle to the road of the vehicle line by the left of the vehicle. No parking within 2 seconds. There's no obstruction on the vehicle.
Radar sensors.
No objects appearing in wider range.
Surroundings fully calculated. Mr. Actuator,
Start the engine. Engage automated pressure. Engage transmission.
select D. And slowly pull vehicle out of parking space. Returning controls over to driver.
Guys, I'm blind, I can't see a thing.
Bill, sign is overrated anyway.
Oh, good, I'm back in the game, copy that too. There's no pedestrians, cyclists, or cars in front of us.
No object the next 36.8 feet.
Excellent, thank you.
People, there's lots going on here. There's pedestrians on the street, cars in front of us, cars approaching pedestrians, cars parking, truck on the road. Really busy out there, but we've got it under control.
Sensing an object approaching on our right.
Front camera, what can you see?
I can tell you with certainty that it's a bicycle.
A bicycle?
Cyclist approaching on the right.
Impending collision in 5 seconds. Prepare for emergency brake. 3, 2, 1. Engage emergency brake. Oh, yeah. Wow. Brilliant job. Thank you.
Let's offer him Audi AI traffic jam pilot.
Sensor, are you ready?
Yeah. He pressed it, I know it.
has been achieved. Please take the next exit on the right.
We're coming out of the traffic jam. Goodbye.
Oh, well, looks like he's taking the photo
Okay, so the video presented the car's mind, the controlling system of autonomous driving, of course, in this, let's say, human understandable form. So the different subsystems were presented as human beings with their, let's say, personal attitudes, but the real autonomous car is actually quite similar. So there are subsystems that are controlling different features of the car. Some of them are responsible for sensors. Some of them are responsible for using the sensors to some perception maps. Some of them are working on like controlling the system. And what is part of our work here in Valeo is developing the system. By the way, the lady laser in that advertisement was actually the Scala 1, which is the product of the R&D center here in Prague. And yeah, so we are doing the validation of subsystems. And how subsystems can be validated? There are different environments that can be used for that. Of course, we want to validate as much as possible in simulators. And in simulators, we can drive maybe millions of miles. Yeah? So this is the best environment to drive. But of course, not everything can be validated in simulators. And then we have proving grounds. Test tracks, one of those which belongs to Valeo is in Lovice on the military airport, and on the test track, this gives us options to do repeated tests always in the same environment. You can have driving robots or steering robots, which can repeatedly execute the same test case in exactly the same conditions. That's why we call it deterministic testing. But this doesn't give us the like colorful real life input that we need to actually validate that the system that we are designing can survive the open road. Therefore, we have to also validate in the real environment where our system will be used on the open road. And I will mainly focus on the open road because the more right we are in this picture, the more expensive the validation is. The main reason is that on the open road we cannot rely on an artificial environment which we can equip with our measurement technique, with our sensors to observe the scene. On the open road, we have to either calculate it directly in the car, or we have to do it during the post-processing using some manual techniques. And just to explain how big this work can be, in general, if we want to design a car like this, which can behave intelligently in urban or highway scenarios, the influencing factors for such a car, which can influence its performance, are many. Some of them are highlighted here on this slide, so that can be like weather or light, like shadows or fog or rain. It can be some traffic participants, like cyclists, pedestrians, other cars. It is, of course, the infrastructure, so curbs, pathways, buildings. It is also the state of the road, like good road, wet road, dirty road, lane markings, and many others. And all those influencing factors can play a role in perception of the sensors or in the behavior of the system. And during the statistical, or during the open road validation, we must make sure that we don't forget any of them. And as don't know all of them in advance, we use some statistical methods to actually estimate how many miles or kilometers we have to drive on the open road, so that with a very high probability we can meet such situations. And on that recorded data, we can basically measure the performance of our system. Our target is, of course, to design systems that are safer than the existing risk on the road. If you go today in your human driving car on the road, there is a certain risk which is known. So, and we set some margin. Today's standard is to use, let's say, one order of magnitude higher. So we work typically with the values like we want to be 20 times safer than the existing systems on the or the human driving cars, and we are estimating the mileage for validation of such a system to those values. So the example here, if you want to validate a subsystem of the triple redundant autonomous driving car, we have to drive approximately 50,000 to 150,000 kilometers, depending on how certain we want to be with our results. The process of validating such a system has several steps. So first of all, we have to build the measurement or the reference car. This car we typically equip with the primary system, which we want to validate. So in the case of an Audi, it would be the Scala laser scanner. And we also equip it with a reference sensor. This is a sensor maybe from Valeo or from some third party, which we use to collect the data that we then compare with our performance. This collection of the data we call data acquisition, and this is actually driving. So it can be tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of kilometers. Once we have the data collected, we extract the ground truth. This is what most part of my presentation will be about. So with the ground truth, we actually annotate or extract what was on the scene, so that we can, in the next step, in the KPI calculation, compare it to the performance of our system. And the last step, when we have the performance calculated, we analyze the results. If there are problems, we solve them, and then deliver the final report to the customer. How such a measurement or a reference vehicle can look like? Okay. So on this picture, this is an article from Czech newspaper a couple of years old. They were saying here that they caught the footage of the self-driving Audi on our roads. You can see the reference center. It's the Velodyne laser scanner, and in front, what you don't see is the Scala. There was quite funny story about this because the journalists actually really believed that we are driving on the roads fully without the driver. The truth was that we had one tester in our team which was like short, and he wasn't from the back. He wasn't seen on the video. So, but the cars were of course driven by our very trained test drivers. This car was used to collect the reference data, and from the reference data we extract the ground truth. So what does it mean? The reference sensors on the car can be laser scanners like the Velodyne or another Scala. It can be cameras. The sensors collect raw data. So camera collects video or images. Laser scanner collects point clouds, and from those raw data, we extract the different ground truth features. The ground truth features depend on how we want to validate, which features of the system we want to validate. So we can extract the pedestrians, we can extract lane markings, we can extract maybe free space, some objects like cars, traffic signs. Or we can extract different features from the point cloud, like dynamic objects, row boundaries, also lane markings, and we put all those features together, and this is basically the ground truth, which we then compare to the performance of the system that we want to deliver to our customer. Here on this video, below you can see how such ground truth extraction of dynamic objects from the LiDAR point cloud can look like. So a human has an application in Windows. He sees there the point cloud. It's not very visible, but here in the front there are small green dots that are corresponding to the front bumper of the car. And the task of this person called annotator is to place the box representing the car in each frame of the video. And this is called annotation, and he does it 8 hours a day in a video that has 30 frames per second. So you can imagine that this is first like not very funny job, and second that it takes incredible amount of time. So now time for first quiz. Do you have any estimation how long does it actually take? So how many minutes will it take to annotate 1 minute of driving? Any guesses? Yeah. Okay, so for one that is 15 hours. 1 hour. Another
1 day.
1 day. Okay, so the typical ratios that we have to depend, of course, very much on features which you want to extract. But let's say typical numbers are somewhere between 100 to 500 maybe. So it really means that 1 minute of driving on the road means maybe 200 minutes of this annotation work, which is a lot. Here you can see just one very rough calculation that if we have a project which wants to validate on 20,000 kilometers with average velocity 50 kilometers per hour, and the ratio 150. And we are doing this in quite a cheap country. It already costs over 1 million euro. And it's just this activity, this annotation. There are no expensive software engineers or hardware engineers in this value. So this is the reason why it makes sense to do this better. And that's why we are here to make this more efficient. There's some unwanted sound in the background video. What you can see here is the visualization of the output of the which we use for the system validation. So the red boxes here is the result of the annotations going to extraction. So this is where the objects really were. The purple lines on the side are the row boundaries from the ground truth. So this is also where the row boundaries really were. And the green boxes correspond to our system outputs. So this is what our different system in the car produces. And what we do in the system validation is that we compare those green boxes with red boxes. And of course, if they are very similar or equal, that's good. Then our system is performing well. If there are differences, we have to analyze them. The methods that we are actually using to make the automation more efficient is a combination of the automation and that manual process. We cannot do it without people completely, because we need to be certain that our ground truth or the method of the validation is precise. But we can automate it so that we prepare it for the human as much as possible. And how we do it, we build a module, we call it the automated labeling or automated ground truth extraction in front of the actual manual ground truth extraction. And in this box, we automatically extract different features. On this picture, you can see two of them. The red boxes here are extracted automatically before the human annotator actually touch them, and the row boundaries as well. So we used some machine learning techniques I will show you on the next slide for one of them. And the input that the human annotator gets is already this, so that the boxes are already there, and his work is to visually check them. If they are okay, he does nothing. If they are not okay, he corrects them. But of course, our target is to make them as precise as possible without human touch. One example of such a machine learning system to extract the ground truth is on this scheme. This is a method which we use to extract the objects from laser scanner point cloud. So what we do, we have a big advantage that we can do this as a post processing. So we don't have to do it real time in the car, but we have all the data available. And we can also work with the future. So we see your whole recording trace, let's say 10 minutes of recording, and we can go back and forth in the recording to make our estimation what objects were there and where the objects were, what were the classes of those objects. So we take the whole recording, point cloud in time, and using convolutional neural network, we first segment which part of this recording are actually the dynamic objects which we are focusing on and which is the background. So from this cluster of place detections, we extract that this is probably belonging to a dynamic object. This we call a detection. In the second step, we associate those measurements in different frames to a single object trajectory. So we go through the whole recording and we associate those detections together to build the trajectories. For that, we also use a neural network. And in the last step, we reconstruct the actual object. We know that the probable objects on the road are cars, so the cars cannot move freely. They have certain physical limitations. They also have certain probable sizes. We use different smoothing techniques, which also work with the knowledge of this vehicle models or object models, and using them, we extract the smooth trajectory and other features of the object, like class, if it is a car or if it is a truck, if it is a motorbike. And at the end, we have the nicely tracked object in the whole trace. For example, if the object was first seen just from the front and then it passed us, we saw it in the full size. We are able to track the object with the full size from the beginning, because the size that we know the future right here. So we use all those techniques to extract those objects. It has some interesting consequences that we use this object reconstruction, because sometimes when we first compared our results with the human annotator's results, we saw some error. And we first saw, okay, so it's the error caused by our systems. We are searching to where we are doing mistake in our automatic annotation. And we actually observed that we are better than the human, because as there are, for example, some jittering effects caused by some, let's say, physical limitations of the laser scanners. The human annotator was annotating what he saw, so on the jitter point cloud. But as we use this smoothing, we were extracting more realistic ground truth, because this jittering effect was smoothened with this last step. This is a visualization of what we can do with such a say automatically extracted ground truth without actual human touching. What you see here above those objects, all the objects are extracted automatically. And what you see about those objects, this is the classification of their relative position to the ego, to this green card, which is our measurement card. So with this, for example, we can extract or classify the driving scenarios. So we can say if the car is in the traffic jam, or if somebody is cutting in front of us, or if we are, say, overtaking somebody. And such classification can be done fully automatically without actual human touching, because for that classification, it is not so important if the object is classified with 5 centimeter precision or 20 centimeter precision. Another example is here on this video downstairs. I cannot run because there is a bad sound, but this is something what we call safety validation or safety annotations. And what we do here, we extract only, we are focusing only on the first car in front of the ego, because this is the car which is relevant for the emergency braking, or this is the possible target for crashing in. So if you want to evaluate the safety of the vehicle, of our system, this is the most critical car for us. And as it is quite well defined where the car shall be, how far it shall be, so that it is still safety critical, we are achieving very high results of the automation on such cars. And we are using also a method to compare such automated annotation with the laser point cloud with the object extraction from the front camera. And we have, let's say, two independent sources of the truth. We automatically compare those two sources, and if they comply on the whole trace, we call it automatically validated trace, and we do not send it to human validation at all. Only when this automatic comparison between the front camera objects and LiDAR objects doesn't agree, we then manually check it, and a human decides what was actually correct. Okay, I promised that I will also tell you how this links to vector validation. This table I took from a very interesting article. It's on this site. If you are interested in this topic, I can send you the link later, because this is a super interesting thing. This is basically an article about how safe must be autonomous driving system, and how to calculate those numbers. So I spoke about 10,000 kilometers, 100,000 kilometers. So what is the theory behind it? And this is one table from this publication, and it is basically saying that we can focus on like different risk aspects on the roads. One such aspect which we are using in Valeo is to look at fatalities. So today we know that there is 1.09 fatality per 100 million miles. We want to be 20 times safer. And using some statistics, we can calculate how many miles, kilometers needs to be driven without failure, without system failure, to validate that we are, for example, 95% confident that we are better than this.
Question on the previous slide. I was thinking, okay, actually, it's quite easy to deal with false positives, right? If your automated system falls. Okay. So I was thinking, what? Okay, I will show. So with the, thank you. Okay, well, no, yeah. So with the false positives, it's relatively easy, right? So if your automated system produces false detections, like for the gas detection, then presumably the producer or the consumer system will fail, because it will not detect these false positives, right, on the data. So, and then this mismatch, there are supposed to be very few such kind of mismatches, and that can be, thrown away by a human validator at the end. But what do you do with the false negatives, right, at the end? Because the scenes are very often empty, or there's almost nothing, and of course there might be very different things in the nothing space. So how do you do this?
First, the statistics. So the number of kilometers that we drive also works with the statistics of the objects on the road. Yeah? So this is one of the input parameters. So we know from our like random driving how many objects we meet on the road, and we are actually validating against this number of objects. So it's of course true that we record many scenes with like empty highway, but the overall number of kilometers takes the number of objects that we need into account. Also the empty miles are relevant for the validation. That's one aspect. And by the way, in that article on the next slide, which I will happily share, that there is also this mathematics around this. How they do this. There is and yeah, the method that we are using is called statistical modeling. Also models other like influencing factors. So one can be how many objects and what type of objects we observe, but it can be, for example, like very special weather. Yeah, so there can be a fog, which is not very often. But what we do is that we take, for example, if you are navigating the car for the Czech Republic, we take the statistical occurrence of the fog from the weather forecast in the last 10 years, and from this percentage, we say how many miles from the 100,000 we have to drive in the fog, so that we have large enough sample to say that our system works also in the fog.
Okay, so I understand. So basically what you are saying, if your complementary system produce consistent result, then you accept those data as validated and so regardless whether they detect something or whether they detect nothing.
Exactly. We of course, to say this, we of course need to be sure that in our ground truth, we have the real ground truth. So there are, we can say what objects were there, and nothing else than the objects in the ground truth. So yeah, for that, for example, I show you that we are also annotating the row boundaries. This is exactly because of this, because we are using the row boundary as a filter to what is relevant for the system, and everything what is outside is irrelevant. So if our system performs well exactly on the objects inside the boundaries, we are certain that it works well with false positives and false negatives. Yeah, so here's back to this table. That here is a very interesting calculation that let's say if you want to drive this number of miles, and we would have 100 test vehicles driving 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, it would take 500 years to record this. And this is, by the way, the fleet of 100 autonomous vehicles I think nobody has, except of Tesla, because they are using also the production cars to record the data. But this is quite clear that this can be done physically, yeah, to bring the system in the market sooner than the competition. And that means that we have to look somewhere else. And somewhere else means to validate big part of the data virtually in a simulator or by some other method. And how this
render photorealistic images using a standard graphics pipeline is, what if we could render an image with a generative? Instead, start with high-level labels that are much easier to create and edit. We present a generative adversarial framework for synthesizing 2K photorealistic images. To show the advantage of this approach, we provide an interactive interface for users to quickly edit objects in the scene. Let's try out our tools.
Yeah, so what you can see here is the link between the ground truth and the simulation. Yeah, so this is the ground truth. There's like semantic representation of the scene, what the annotated bit from the real data, and what the guys do here, that they are changing the different. They are basically generating the new real world from the ground truth. So they wanted to have a car behind that. Okay, why not? They can do that. They want some trees behind. So they just draw it here in the ground truth, and these are generated. Here they are showing how to do it also on faces. It's not this idle skip, but that's the general idea of the generative approach, which can utilize the ground truth to generate real-like scenes. What you can see here is another like a nice visualization of this generative approach. So we have a real video of a horse, and behind there was a system, machine learning system that learned how to do the transformation of the horse to zebra. And so the result video is the zebra, and this is how we can, for example, this is the approach which can be used to generate, for example, the corner cases in the scene. So if we know that we want to collect more, I don't know, some special kind of cars in the scene, but we don't really need them on the road, we can use such system to actually adapt the reality a little bit towards those corner cases to actually generate them. Another approach is to tweak the weather. Yeah, so it can be simple to record the data in some nominal weather, like a nice weather, but nobody wants to drive night shifts. But we still need a lot of data there, so we can train a system which adapts the day, like sunny scenes to night scenes, or to adapt the sunny scenes to foggy scenes. Similar thing here with changing the season. Yeah. So sometimes we are late with projects, so we are finishing our validation in the winter, but we still want to validate the sunny weather. Yeah. So can actually generate another approach is that there are nowadays very nice game engines which can generate very realistic scenes, but there can be actually systems trained to do the next step. So from a nice computer game simulation, we can extract the real, almost like real looking scene. So this is again by training machine learning system from the real data. Similar thing we can do not only with the video, but also with other sensors like laser scanners. On this picture, we see some simulation with a simulated laser scanner, 360 degrees output, and our colleagues actually trained a system that extracts the Velodyne output from this perfect sensor, or it even extracts our Valeo Scala 2 sensor output. And the last let's say link between the ground truth and the actual validation is that we actually, if we collect the reference data with one sensor, for example, in this case with Velodyne, we invest the effort to actually annotate it. You know, those millions of euros to extract the ground truth. We can reuse this effort for another sensor. So here on this visualization, somebody extracted the Carla laser scanner from Velodyne, and the ground truth doesn't change. The ground truth is independent on the reference sensor. So they do not need to annotate this again. They just change the sensors. So there is a huge potential in reuse of the ground truth with different simulation and generative techniques to extend the database which is then used for the system evaluation. But by that, this is the last slide on my presentation. So I would say now it's time for questions.
Question?
Large circuit. So there are annotation tools, you are not the only one, I think. So maybe could you mention the state of the art one, the best published ones you know about? What do you do?
Yeah. The problem with the state of the art annotation tools or approaches is that many of those are let's say coming from the academic field, and they are there is still a long path from them, let's say from the state in which they are to the actual use. By the way, the methods that I presented that we are using for objects and open extraction are of course also coming from some academic publications. We haven't tried to invent the wheel. The thing what we are doing is actually to bring those methods to the production use. We are say on our path to this. We of course met many companies and solutions for the automation of ground extraction. Say one of those that is very often used by car manufacturers is the company Valeo, which is also producing the laser scanners, but they also work on the automation. However, say the difficulty of those let's say externally available systems is always in details. Yeah? So in environment where they are working on the measurement distance or detection distance that they support, on the exact features that they expect. Because at the end we have to design our validation system to be compliant with the requirements of our customers. So if the customer says, I want to measure the precision of my markings up to 2 centimeters, and there is a solution on the market with, say, 10 centimeters precision, we have to do something with it. So either use that method from the market and build additional layer which will help us to decide if we can use it automated data or if we can collect it somehow automatically, or if we will build something in-house, or if we will do it fully manually. That is also actually quite often an approach, because I would say those like automation methods to be used in the real life for real system validation. This is still, let's say, on the rising edge. So not many projects actually do it. And one of the reasons is also that the requirements are not like designed to be compliant with such automation methods. Yeah? So what we are also doing in our group is to spread this know-how. So what can be done automatically? What can be virtualized and spread it to function owners? So to design the requirements with the customer so that those methods can be actually used. This is also quite important factor.
Question. Raise the question, maybe a silly one. So, how is the situation in the Czech Republic? Does Czech government cooperate with this? Because I just recently been in Syria, and they are quite keen to the companies like yours. They providing data. They have a system how to anonymize the data, but they are counting, the cars on the highways, and they're doing many things, right?
So you probably know about this more than me, but my perception of such activities is that the government or the public authorities are starting to be interested in that, but let's say the biggest focus is still, of course, from the commercial sector. Yeah, so we are mainly driven by customer projects and also by our internal platforms, because it is already obvious that that the cost of doing this is so high that like any investment to do it once automatically is worth to be done. So we know it in Valeo. We are starting to collect budget in our platforms for that. But I think it is still, let's say, not fully on the government level. In the Czech Republic, I would say, because in other countries, you certainly know that there are publicly funded projects which are already in productions that can deliver a big part of that for the industry. So in Germany, in Netherlands, there are automated highways, say tens of kilometers of highways, which are equipped with measurement technique. Like every 50 meters, camera, high-speed communication networks, and a method how the vendors can actually book the highway for a certain time without public traffic for their validation purposes. Yeah, so this exists in other European countries. I know that there are several discussions also in the Czech Republic, but I'm not something is close to be signed.
Maybe I can add something into it. I'm leading site. Spoke to Ministry of Transportation, and there are several projects running. There is close to Benešov, the highway. They are preparing the sensors for V1, but you know the situation in V1, so I don't know when this really happened. And there is study, feasibility study, or no, selection process for feasibility study for the national test track. Two biggest activities I'm aware of. Otherwise, in terms of, for example, legislation for testing the cars, the roads, no, there is nothing started. There's discussions.
Thank you for the nice talk. Just curious about the use of synthetic data, because you mentioned that you can, for example, use traffic scenes on the day and then pass it to night, and that is it. But then the driving conditions in the night are different. The driver behavior is different. Much more drunken people, much more careless people, and the same with winter. Maybe people is more careful, or there are some situations in the road that. You don't see it on the camera channel, but you see it in something else. So how do you account for this differences?
Yeah, that's a good question. The point is that this scientific data approach can extend the database, the data set for validation, but it of course cannot be used as a single source. So we still need to collect enough open road data at night to have the theory behind how many miles we actually collect in the real world and how many miles we simulate to let's say avoid some biases. Also, the techniques that are used is the simulation or is the usage of the some intelligent noise. So if you use such synthetic data, you don't just throw a single trace of the ground truth. We generate a single trace in the simulator, but we apply some noise model that actually generates multiple simulated scenes, and our system has to comply with all of them. So by that we can achieve that there is not specific bias to specific vehicle model in the simulator.
Again. In what you showed was the validation on the lowest level, where you had basically the raw data. If one is building an autonomously driven car, there is a generalization going on the data, where you are slowly forgetting the raw data and you have concepts which are growing up. And from my experience, it is also good to use such an annotation tool on that more conceptual level. And my question is if you work on that as well.
We don't. I know what you are talking about from your presentation.
So we do.
The systems that we are, let's say, nowadays validating in Valeo are not working with this like semantic levels. Yes. No.
I had a question here. So, Dr. Lauren from Charles University, I'm very much interested in synthetic data for validation or for training. That's what I will be talking about. And one question that I had regarding the use of generative, generative statistical models is that whether, like, to what extent this really makes sense from some kind of an information content point of view, because those models need data to be trained in the first place, right? So if you have the data that you then use to train a generative network that you will then use to like validate or maybe train another statistical system that will do whatever it will do, does that even make sense at all?
The answer is yes, because you can sometimes collection of the data for such a generative approach is much cheaper. You can imagine the example is that let's say we have a car equipped with Scala 1, so one laser scanner. We invest the effort to annotate this data. So we have a database of ground truth. And now we would like to reuse this ground truth for Scala 1 in different mounting positions. So the vendor decided to move it 10 centimeters higher in the car, and I don't want to drive another 100,000 kilometers because of 10 centimeters moved up. So what we could do, we will take a car, we will equip it with two sensors. One will be in the original position, the second one in the new one. And by that, we will drive outside, and this could be used to actually collect the training set for such an approach. And the advantage of this training set would be that you do not need to annotate it. It's just by collection in the car with those two sensors in two different mounting positions. It's already the training set. Yeah, so what I would like to say is this, that sometimes it doesn't have to be the same cost to train the system. And even if it would be, the learning transformation could be maybe used like multiple times. Yeah, so even without this, I would say it would make sense to use such approaches.
Thank you.
Because we are running slightly out of time, I would recommend to take a break, 15 minutes now, and then we will continue with the next speaker and the next presentation. So once again, thank you very much to Valeo.
So thanks for coming. I'm a little bit of an outsider here because I will admit right away that I have actually very little connection to the industry of self-driving cars. But I do have some connection to this technology nonetheless, and I will try to kind of like explain what this connection really is. And this connection will take us through nuclear reactions, will take us through some pretty pictures, all the way to the self-driving cars movement. Okay, so before I start, I will just introduce myself a little bit. I've been doing research in computer graphics and mostly in rendering, so image synthesis for quite a number of years. Got my degree from the Technical University, then a PhD in France from INRIA, from the lab of INRIA. Then I spent some years at Cornell University, which is the place that have actually done like the first ever physically validated synthetic images in the world, and they've been validated on this nice scene called Cornell Box that many people from computer graphics know. And then eventually in 2010, I returned to Charles University and started the third computer graphics group there. And of course, computer graphics is very much an applied field, so there's been some collaboration with the industry. And throughout the years, the collaboration was mostly with companies specializing in visual effects for movies. So I've contributed to various rendering systems in companies such as Sony Pictures Imageworks, Weta Digital, those are the people behind Lord of the Rings and Avatar, and Pixar, which you probably know. And things have changed quite a bit for me in 2014 when a PhD student of mine and another colleague and myself started this company originally called Render to develop and commercialize a rendering system called Corona. This has been quite successful. We specialize mostly in generating synthetic images for architectural visualization. But it's a general rendering system that you can use just about for anything. Since 2017, the company became a part of a company, Chaos Group, and I have essentially, from there on, I have essentially moved back to my research activities instead of management of the company, which is on my head list. So the agenda for today is actually mostly focusing on what I know about, what my background is, and then toward the end I will try to make this this connection to the self-driving cars and especially to the data generation for the statistical learning systems. And so I will start with a little bit of an introduction of realistic rendering. I will also make a connection to 3D printing as an introduction of how this can actually be used apart from just entertainment industry, and then eventually I will get to the autonomous driving. So predictive rendering. Okay, so what is rendering about? Rendering is about using computer to generate imagery, which is either very realistic, as you can see it in just about every Hollywood blockbuster today. You can use it to do more stylized computer animation, but also in various creative fields, namely architecture. Today, it's virtually possible to propose an architectural project without having a good visualization of how the building would look like, and that goes for exteriors and interiors of the buildings. One thing that you may not know is that also catalogs that you often look at are very often generated synthetically on a computer, and this goes specifically for the very famous IKEA catalog. And this history kind of like started low, first 10 years of the 2000s, people started hearing about these realistic, super realistic images that we can do on the computers, so they tried to insert this one single chair, which was computer generated, into the catalog, hoping that it will go through. It totally did, no one actually noticed. So since then, they have started putting more and more of these synthetic images into the catalog. And today, if you open up the kitchen section, about 70% of that are images that are generated on the computer. So when you, this is already getting us closer to what we're interested in, cars. But especially like for marketing purposes, cars are essentially only rendered. You very rarely take pictures of real cars driving somewhere in some environments. Why? Because of course you have extremely detailed models of these cars coming from the CAD systems that are used to build the cars in the first place. The second thing, well, cars are a nice man-made project, very shiny, very easy to render and simulate. And it's definitely much cheaper than taking pictures of real cars. So what is this rendering about? So as I said, it's a computer process for generating images that look like photographs of the real world. So what you have on the input is some kind of a description of the virtual environment that you want to so-called render. So we have a description of the geometry, description of the reflectance properties or appearance of various surfaces in the scene, a light and virtual camera. And then comes this process, that's this arrow here, this rendering. And what you are asking this rendering to do is to generate this photorealistic image. And if you want to generate something that really looks like reality, the way we approach it here is that we try to recreate, really simulate as closely as possible the behavior, the real behavior of light as it's interacting with this environment. And there's a lot of commercial software for doing exactly that, and one of them is the one developing in a company. But what they really, all of them have in common is the basic underlying idea of simulating the physics of light in order to generate the images. So you can formulate the whole problem as, I'm creating a matrix of pixels, and each of these pixels needs to have a color, and my goal is to compute this color. So what is this color going to be? Well, I'm going to look at all the possible different ways in which rays reflecting and somehow interacting with the scene can get from the light sources all the way to the camera through that particular pixel, and I will average all of these contributions, and this is going to be nice. And I will have to do this for every single pixel of the image. So it's a super involved process that is based on so-called Monte Carlo simulation, Monte Carlo integration. So it's a statistical process that slowly converges to the final result. At the beginning, you get some noisy estimate, which is eventually converging to some nice simulated image. So as I said, this is very slow, and it's so slow that people are actually making fun of it. I really like this picture here because yeah, that's how it is. You usually set up things to render, and then maybe 10 hours later you get your image if you're lucky. So for this reason, for many years, much of my research has been focusing on reducing this computational time so that we can get the images in something more reasonable. And this goes back to years of research on so-called variance reduction in Monte Carlo methods, and you can do quite well. We have been actually applying some statistical, machine learning approaches to speed up this rendering. So this is actually quite funny because one thing is that you use some statistical learning machinery to speed up this rendering, and then you take these renderings to then use that as an input to some other statistical learning machinery. So anyway, so this is some research that I have been doing over the years on speeding up the rendering process. And just to give you some, like one concrete, tangible example of the kind of research that one does in realistic rendering, I have taken this project that I have worked on with a colleague of mine, Eugene Dion, when I was visiting Meta Digital, that company that did Lord of the Rings, back some 5 years ago in New Zealand. Okay, so question for you. What are we looking at right here? Any idea? Yes, it's a finger. It's a finger. It really is. And what is so interesting about it is that it's very translucent, as you can see, right? It's extremely translucent. It's quite incredible just how translucent human skin is. And the translucency of the human skin gives rise to some very important visual effects that you can see on the skin that are due to the fact that the light, as it interacts with the skin, can reflect, but it can also scatter in various layers of the skin before it emerges at a totally different location. And the net effect that we can actually observe due to that are these incredible, interesting fringes of between lit areas and unlit areas of the skin. First, there is this yellowish fringe, which is the light from the lit area that got just below the surface of the skin and then emerged in the shade. And then there is this reddish fringe, which is the light that got all the way into the flash and then got out in the skin, right? And so this is very typical, like if you are trying to recreate an image of a human and you wouldn't simulate these effects, then these humans just wouldn't look human-like, and we would see it immediately because we are very good at looking at humans. And so if you want to regenerate a faithful image of a human on a computer, you really have to simulate this crazy scattering behavior of light as it penetrates under the skin and then it interacts with the tissue. Yes, tissue was the word I was using. And okay, so you can do this. You can do this out of the box, and it's going to take ages because the simulation will simply not know that it's supposed to kind of find where the light is coming from up front, and it will just wiggle around, and the convergence will be extremely slow. So in this little project, we have set this goal. Okay, we want to run the simulation, but we want to make sure that this will finish in some acceptable amount of time. So what we want to do is run this Monte Carlo simulation of light wiggling under the surface, but we also want to make sure that soon enough the light will the process will kind of like emerge back and hopefully find where the light is coming from so that it can do what it's supposed to be doing. I will recall connecting light sources to the camera. And this is interesting. This is a very interesting problem which actually connects very closely to what you are doing when you are simulating behavior of neutrons in a nuclear reactor. So from the point of view of the physical theory that we are running here, a neutron is the exact same thing as a photon. It's a neutral particle that floats around in space along straight trajectories. And you are also assuming that these particles do not collide together, which gives rise to some quite nice formula that you can then be solving. What it means for us is that when we are simulating the behavior of light, we can just look back at 60 years of literature, or well, much more actually by now, years of literature in the simulation of neutron transport for the sake of building nuclear reactors. And indeed, one specific problem there, which is very closely related, is the design of the shields of these nuclear reactors. And the problem is essentially, okay, so here's the incident radiation. Of course, you don't want any of this radiation to penetrate out, but a little bit of it will, okay? So usually the margin is that 1 out of a billion of these neutrons is allowed to go through. And you want to run a simulation that for a given geometry of the reactor shield will give you an estimate of how much of this radiation actually makes it through. Now imagine that you run really a random simulation when you are throwing these particles at this shield and just counting how many of them makes it through. Well, only 1 out of a billion will actually survive, and you need to make a reasonable statistical estimate. You need at least thousands of them to go through. So you're not now talking about following the lifetime of 1 trillion of particles, and we are somewhere in the 60s, and it's quite clear that you can still not compute it even today in some reasonable way. So they were looking at ways of reformulating this problem of simulating the lifetime of the particle by modifying the rules so that they get more particles going through than particles actually going back into the reactor. So somehow they wanted to instruct the simulation to send these particles more in this direction they went back. And this led to an interesting theory, which essentially boils down to saying, well, if you roughly know what the solution of the radiation in this problem will be, then you can use this to guide the computation to make more reasonable decisions. And then you keep digging in this literature, and you find out that if you assume that if we're going back to the skin, and we will assume that our skin is a semi-infinite medium, then you can actually find an exact solution for radiation in the system, which is given in a closed-form formula, which is as beautiful as what you can see here. Well, long story short, you put all these formulas together and take formulas that people have developed for a totally different purpose, and voila, you get the rendering of a skin much faster than you can do before. For us, faster means with less noise. So we usually would compare some number of simulation runs, how noisy the final image is, because like the variance of the multi-core simulation is shown as noise. This was done in a movie company, which means that my images are really ugly, because the nice images I'm not allowed to take them outside of the company because they belong to the production studio, and I just cannot take them out. So that's why you're seeing images that are just like very rough tests that we were running as I was visiting the company. There are some more here. So, as I said, we have developed this at Reza for their in-house use. This was published, and little by little, all the other big players in this field of visual effects have adopted exactly this idea. So today, when you watch a movie from Pixar or Disney or Reza, you may be quite sure that some of the formulas that have generated these pixels are actually coming dating back to the work that was done in the 60s in nuclear reactors and my person as I was visiting. So this is, so you see, what we're doing here is simulating some kind of a radiation, And we use this for this purpose of just creating nice images. So it seems like, hey, we're doing serious science, so but can we not use it for something else than just these images? And so we have been going in this direction, okay? And I will eventually, in this presentation, close the loop by saying, okay, of course, we can use this to generate data for self-driving cars, but before I make that claim, let me make a small detour into the area of 3D printing and explaining how this technology can help to produce more faithful reproduction in 3D printing. So 3D printing has been around for quite some time, and you know it. There's Prusa in Prague, and if you talk to a person on the street about 3D printing, they will imagine these like not so good looking one single color 3D prints, but there is technology that can do much more. Essentially the same, there's a full color 3D printing technology based on photopolymer jetting, which is a technology very similar to your regular inkjet printer, except that as you print the layers, there's a UV curing step which solidifies each of these layers, and then you just build these layers on top of each other. The important thing is that unlike in any other technology that's available on the market, every single droplet can be of a different material. So you can mix them together and you can get incredible visual complexity out of these 3D prints. But then okay, so these are marketing images from Stratasys, the company that holds the patent for this technology. But then you start looking up closer and you start seeing that, well, maybe this 3D printed sushi isn't just the right thing, like the real sushi should really look like. And it kind of like reminds us of where we were with creating so-called realistic images on a computer back in the 90s, where we thought, okay, this is realistic. Now we look back at the Toy Story 1 and we're like, okay, what were these people thinking? And well, this is it, like we can somehow do some kind of a realistic 3D printing, but it's still quite far off from what we would like to get out of the 3D. So we have this new problem set up to look into, which is that someone gives us the so-called target appearance, some kind of an appearance of a 3D printout that I want to get out of the 3D printer. And my task is to figure out the instructions to the 3D printer that will make sure that whatever the 3D printer prints out will be visually as close as possible to the given target appearance, right? So that's well, and our task is figure out what these gears that you see moving here, what they should be. So that's what we're doing. And so I will just mention one work that we did in this direction. And we have started with this problem of being able to put some kind of a visual texture on the 3D printout. And those are some of the printouts that came out of this project. So we are working with the Stratasys J750. This is like a 300,000 euro 3D printer, a huge machine that can print with up to 7 materials at the same time. So it's a classic CMYK combination that you see when you print on a 2D paper. But of course, there's no paper, so you also need a white material because you're not printing on paper. So those are the materials, and the producer advertises them as the Vero opaque family. And if they have one property in common, is that they are absolutely not opaque. These materials are actually very, very translucent, and they have to be translucent no matter what, because the technology is based on the fact that you will be curing by UV light, and the UV light needs to be able to reach everywhere inside of the droplet of the material, because otherwise it wouldn't be able to cure it at all. So no matter what, it has to be penetrable to at least UV light, and usually things that UV light can penetrate, also visible light can penetrate. So these things are translucent. And why is that interesting? Well, the thing is, if you take an image and you send it to the 3D printer as a texture and say, you know, print a slab with this texture, what's going to come out is something super, super blurry. Because of all the internal scattering that is going on inside of the materials of the 3D printer, there will be so much blurring that you will lose all of the details of the original texture. And so our goal in this project, what can we do to counteract this? Like, what can we do to get 3D printouts of things like this nice and sharp? By the way, this is not a made-up problem. I have been talking to people involved in this, also the reseller of the Stratasys printers in the Czech Republic, and actually many interesting car parts, especially from the interiors, are actually prototyped using these printers, and they hate it because everything looks much blurrier than it's supposed to. Okay, so it's a problem that people are kind of fighting, and we said, okay, let's have a look what we can do. So what we have so far, so those are the textures that are input to the printer. This is what would the default driver of the printer. If you run it and send this to the printer, this is what's going to come out. So you see complete loss of detail, and this is what comes out with our approach. And this is just software. We haven't touched the materials, and we haven't touched the hardware of the printer. All we do is being reasonably smart about where we place the materials, knowing how the light radiation interacts with these 3D printers. Because people around 3D printing have absolutely no idea what's going on there, and that's why they are producing this. Okay, so the motivation is actually like coming from image pre-correction. So imagine that you have a person looking with some kind of a really bad myopia or something, and this person is looking at an image like this, and what that person is going to see is going to be that. What can you do about it? Okay, well, you can correct the optical system by the correction that at least 50% of people in this room use, including myself. Or you can say, okay, well, what if there's nothing I can do about the optical system? Okay? What if I am just doomed? Okay, this optical system has this limitation, and I can't do anything. Well, then what you can do is actually pre-correct the input to the optical system, so that when it is degraded by the known degradation, it will look somewhat closer to what it was supposed to look like in the first place. Okay? So this is the pre-correction. And this is our situation. We have the scattering inside of the 3D print. This will happen no matter what. There's nothing we can do about it. So can we pre-correct the input that's coming to the printer so that we get something better? But for image processing people, well, this is not just a simple image processing task, because the 3D print is actually a full 3D volume, and you're really deciding about every single voxel what kind of material this should be signed. So it's not a simple image pre-correction project. So at the end of the day, after 2 years of not knowing what we were doing, we came up with this pipeline which does the job. So on the input, you get the target appearance, and there's some optimization, outcome, the instructions of what materials should be, how the materials should be distributed in the volume, and this is then sent to the printer, and out comes the printer. And now what's in this optimization box here is that is that we have some optimization loop where we have a current solution. We run a prediction of how the 3D printout would look like should the distribution be like this. Then we compare it, this is what it would look like, this is what we really want, we see there's a mismatch, so we update this distribution and we predict again. And so really the prediction is a key component of this. Like without being able to predict how exactly this is going to look like, you would never be able to build such a. Okay. So again, I'm trying to sell this point that it's very important to be able to run the simulation of light transport as accurately as possible. And, well, why did I talk about the skin in the first place? Because the scattering properties of these 3D printing materials are in fact very similar to those of human skin. So we can just run the same simulation out of the box that I talked about before. And what we get is this. So this is our prediction, and this is the actual 3D printout. And you see, it's quite hard to spot any difference, okay? There are some small differences, but it's quite accurate, you know. We are really able to synthesize very, very accurate predictions of how this would look like should it be printed. And with that, we can just keep refining the solution. So this is our first shot. It's very pale, not good. So we keep adding more contrasted material until we converge to the final solution. Okay, and since we are, and this is then sent to the 3D printer, and this is what we get out of it. So these are the inputs that we want to print. This is what the default driver would do, so loss of detail, and this is what we actually get. And these intermediate, I'm skipping it. This would be like, you know, if we only did some simplifications, which, as it turns out, is not sufficient. Of course, we're talking about 3D printing, so it would be too boring if we only applied it to 2D prints. So we also went 3D. So this is the input. This is the computer. This is the manufacturer provided driver. This is, in the meantime, Fraunhofer have started working in the same area. So they have another driver, and this is our printer. Okay, so you see, we're definitely much better at recovering the appearance of the input than this repetition that you see. And also, we deal with like thin structures. So here you see there's a 3D model here, and there's a lot of the color is actually kind of penetrating through the objects, and we're making sure that we regenerate, we recover this this white surface as we should. And so, as I said, it is this problem of recovering textures in 3D printing. It is interesting, and one of the very interesting projects actually on top of that is a collaboration that we have with a student from the Brno University of Technology, who just for his bachelor thesis, he just sat down and they had this printer in his lab, and he started printing his own eye because he lost an eye when he was a kid. So now he uses prosthetics for one eye, and he started doing that. And so this is one of the early prototypes that he did, and you see it shows exactly the same kind of problems that I was talking about in the first place. You know, the image that you should see here of the eye is really blurred, very blurred, and that's because of what the printer is doing. So we ran our optimization, and we're able to get something better out of it. You know, this is a very early prototype of the collaboration, and we hope that we can optimize it further on. So this is just one of the examples where this kind of technology could be actually useful. And now, what does it have to do with autonomous driving? So with this, I would like to close the loop of my story, going back to making the point that accurate simulation of light transport might be actually something that is relevant to self-driving cars. So far, this whole technology about realistic rendering has been mostly driven by the gaming and especially by the movie industry. But the moment you start applying this into, let's say, more serious industry applications, well, it turns out that you don't care about pretty images anymore. You really care about correct images. Images are correct in the sense that they have a predictive power, in the sense that you can simulate how something would look like should it be produced before actually producing it. So that's the whole point. And why would this be useful for self-driving cars? Why? Well, because as we know, all of these systems are based on machine learning. They need a lot of data to be reliable, and this data is very difficult to come by. Well, one thing is driving around. Second thing is annotating manually all the data that you capture, right? As we have heard. And well, some situations are really hard to come by. Okay, I mean, some situations are going to be rare. Like, how often do you run into a hailstorm on a road? Okay, like, how do you get the footage of this? Well, it's probably not going to be something that you will be able to do. Or they can be very dangerous, okay? And you don't want to simulate situations where a person is going to die. So, so you may turn out to synthesizing these images. And one approach is using these generative models that we talked about. Another approach is actually doing the proper simulation of the environment. And so I'm going back to this image that I showed at the beginning, where I'm saying, okay, rendering is the process that gets a model of a scene and produces a realistic image. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that, well, I have to have a 3D model of the scene to generate that image in the first place. So everything that I get out is automatically annotated because I did have to have the 3D data. Right? So there's definitely no manual annotation. Of course, there's building the 3D scenes, which is also some work that is someone will have to do it, or some computer. You know, that's a question. Okay, but like the moment you have the 3D scene, well, then you definitely don't need to annotate anything that comes out of the automatically annotate, and that's an important thing. So people, one thing that people have been doing actually quite a lot is using game engines for this purpose. And so, you know, here's an example. You take Grand Theft Auto, and of course, since you have hacked the engine, you know exactly what is a road, what is a car, what is what, and you can train a system that is going to do nice semantic segmentation. You know, it will know what's a road, what's a car, what's a wall, and so on. So that's great. And the great thing about this is that you can get many of these images because, like, it's a real-time engine. It can generate one image every 30 milliseconds or something. Okay? So this is great for getting really huge amounts of data. You know, this is how these images from the games would look like. But of course, there are limitations. You know, there are some situations where simply this will never be enough. Okay? I mean, no game engine will ever simulate a hailstorm. It will never simulate a road condition like this, or you know, or a mirage like this. Okay? And this is something that can confuse your vision system very, very effectively. You know, this is essentially as if, like, how is this system going to know that this is a mirage and not an icy road? Well, yeah, it should probably get some reasonable training. This and this, none of this is ever going to come out of your game engine. That is something that I can guarantee you. If you want to get a reasonable simulation of this, you need to be much more careful about the light transport simulation. So that's my point that I wanted to say here. And so this is something that people have been talking, and we have been actually contacted by many groups working in this direction with questions about what can we do to improve the quality of the synthetic data that are coming to the self-driving cars. And in terms of research, what we need is high fidelity rendering. Okay, so some better fidelity rendering. We also need some other modalities in rendering than just visible light. So specifically radar, which behaves very differently than visible light. Essentially, if you have a radar, everything looks like it's made of glass. And this is difficult to render realistically. You know, like simulating all of the different reflections of a radar to get good training data is actually a difficult rendering problem if you want to get that simulation really right. So that's definitely an open problem that needs some work in that. So some convergence between, simulations that are being done today for creating nice visual images and simulations that are being done to simulate behavior radar is something that should eventually be put together and be used to produce this training data. So out of all the people, we have started mostly talking with people from DFKI in Saarbrücken. So those are the people with whom we are, I cannot even say like collaborating. It's more like talking to them and telling them what to do, and they're doing it somehow themselves. What I wanted to mention before I wrap up is that, as I said, I am one step in the academia, other step in the industry. So we're building an industrial lab for research in rendering. So that's our main goal. This is where we are coming from. And the rendering is one thing, is the rendering problem itself, where you are given the data and you're generating the realistic image. The second question is like, where do you get the data? That's also an extremely relevant problem. Should this technology be ever used to produce input imagery for self-driving cars, which is like, where do you get the assets? Where do you get the data? Where do you get the 3D models of these like hypothetical situations that could actually happen? So when it comes to generating data, so we have already seen the use of generative models to produce the final images. But me coming from where I'm coming, I have some reservations to this. Okay, and maybe they are not so important. Maybe they are important. The important thing is that when you ask a generative model to create a final image, this image, I mean, there's no guarantee that this is going to be a consistent image. It can break all the physical laws that shouldn't be broken, because the neural network has absolutely no idea what the laws are, and it's just like putting things together. It's just drawing samples from some statistical distribution. So there's no guarantee that whatever image this network generates is consistent. Very often those images will be something that the car will just never be able to see, because they are not following the laws of physics. So I believe that it's better to use this in a different way. Okay, so this person does not exist.com. You go there, you click, and you get these images of non-existing people, right? So if you get images of non-existing people, well, then you can probably get images of various assets that are actually input into the rendering system. So for example, different sky conditions. Yes, you can generate that, but unlike generating the final image for the self-driving car, if you only generate these assets, then you run it through a physical simulation, you know that whatever image comes out of this, well, it will at least follow the physical laws of the world that we live in. So you might be more sure that this is going to be a consistent image, relevant for what your car should be learning about the world. Yeah, so this is just an example of some skies that we have generated using a generative network. Yeah, I mean, this is just for fun. We're also looking into non-photorealistic rendering, because at some point the artists get bored with just generating all these over and over. So they want to be able to reproduce their style. This is totally irrelevant for what we're talking about here, but it's included this work. Okay, so let's wrap up. This is where we are at Matfis, so come visit. It's this big building in the middle of Baustranskaya Amnesty that no one knows that this is Matfis, so this is it. It's a former monastery. This is where the company lives, so you can come and you can even work with us. We're definitely looking for people. And there's community in Prague. We run the winter conference every year. I mean, this is an old image. It's called Hyviscom, and we would be happy if you want to come and talk there. We run barbecues. We had one yesterday, which made it really hard for me to prepare this talk. Yeah, thanks to the collaborators and the funding agencies. Thanks very much. For
Hello, Veronica. Just a question, how small is the point that should be printed in the 3D printer? So what you calculate or what you observe?
It's 14 microns. Very small. Less than what you get.
Will the slides be somewhere at the level?
Yes, they can be available. Actually, the whole talk is available as being screened. The slides are right.
Second question maybe. I also, if you printed this 3D images, something with holographic ideas or holographic gathering,
We have not, but some people did. But you need a different printing technology. But there are actually commercially available nanostructure printers. It's a very like early version of it, so like it's super limited. But you can do it, and with that you can really start creating structural coloring in the sense that. In the same way that birds produce color, because they have these like layered structures inside of the feathers, so you can actually start printing these structures and get the structural coloring out of it, which is very exciting, but the hardware is not yet. So we will need some work.
I have a question. You mentioned that you don't like very much those approaches based on the statistics and generative things. I'm wondering how does this mathematical or physical modeling of situations like those hails and sky work? If you can explain how you can do it, like other than by those statistical learning methods.
Well, okay, so first of all, if I claim that I didn't like the generative methods, I didn't really mean them. I mean, I love them, they're great. And I just wanted to point out that they actually contain no information about like the physical laws that rule produce some kind of like a consistent law. And this might be dangerous or not. Just up for discussion. I just wanted to present it as an intro. But yeah, when it comes to simulating these extreme situations, you of course need a model of impact. Okay, so first of all, you need a physical model of how a hailstorm actually behaves. So you need to really run physical simulations of these hails falling down and bouncing on the road and so on and so forth. So that's one thing. Second thing is that you need, second ingredient is that you need a model of the interaction of light with these individual droplets of ice, which is something that you can measure. It's okay, I mean, it's not so extremely difficult, but it's a pretty tedious work in essentially modeling the real world that you would have to do. Like from the point, I mean, specifically for a hailstorm, from the point of view of rendering, I don't think this would be so complicated. The real problem is the simulation of the behavior of these, millions of droplets of ice falling down on Earth. It's something that's like extremely computational.
And are you collecting this data by yourself? So before you start drawing such nice pictures with these hails, you have to go outside with some super camera optics and collect data, or you somehow buy models? So how does this work?
Well, these images of hailstorm are not generated. These were real pictures, okay? But yeah, I mean, these images are all synthetic, okay? So you build. I mean, someone have measured or have measured data of like how does light reflecting a piece of plastic or a piece of wood or a piece of any other material, and then you just like put it together and you present it with the render. So you don't need to really go out and collect data maybe for something. So that's when you are talking about fully synthetic rendering, you don't need to collect data because it's not a statistical approach. When it comes to the images that I was showing of the skies, yes, for that we are walking around with a camera and set it up and let it just take pictures of the skies every day. It's a very tedious job, especially now because it's important. You need to take this.
Christian, we're speaking about the rendering and on the real lighting, so there's some big, I would say, breakthrough on the field of colors. You know, the NVIDIA RTX cards, which enable the ray tracing. So what do you say on this?
Okay, so this technology essentially it doesn't really fundamentally change the rules of the game. It's the whole conceptual idea of, okay, I have a model, 3D model of a scene, and out comes a simulated image. It's still the same. The only thing that changes is that, maybe the time it takes to generate that image might be different. And of course, some speed ups may change the rules of the game. If you get something that, if you get 1,000 times speed up on something, then you can start using it interactively or something like that. But I don't think this will be happening. The simulation is still something that takes at least minutes, if not hours, to run, and this technology will probably last. And there's also this very famous the Blink's law of rendering, which says as the computers are constantly increasing in computational power, rendering still takes the exact same amount of time because people just keep pushing and pushing the limits of the complexity of the input scenes and the faithfulness with which you are modeling the rules.
If I may, you mentioned several times things like convergence, and I was thinking, okay, how do you recognize that you are done? Kind of. So if I understand, the ultimate goal is to create an image array that is undistinguishable from real. So, and of course there are some, financial limits, like to compute it at finite time and so on. So you probably stop your iterations after some time and compare the results after 100 iterations. But ultimately, how do you recognize that you are done? Does it mean that no one or nothing, like any other algorithm, can recognize that the image you produce is fake or computer generated and it's not real?
Okay, so there are essentially two important steps in producing a realistic image in this framework, in this synthetic framework that I was talking about. And one is producing the 3D model, the basic input of the rendering system itself, and then the rendering system, the simulation of the light transport given the input. Yeah. And so whenever I was talking about the convergence and the speed of rendering, I was really talking about what happens in the simulation. So given that someone has produced the input model, what happens then? And this is some kind of a probabilistic Monte Carlo process that suffers from variance at the early stages of the computation and then slowly converges. It is, you can very easily estimate the variance of every single pixel, and whenever this variance is below 3%, or whenever your statistical area is below 3%, you say that you are done because you know by the law of human vision, the Weber law, that people will not be able to see any difference, any make the computation. Okay, so that's the simple part. Now the complicated part is actually the input model that goes into the renderer itself, right? So you need to have a precise model of the geometry, you need to have a precise model of the reflectance properties. Of course, you need all these textures that you see here. You need the model of the light sources and all of that. And producing a realistic image means that you really need very good, accurate models for all of these things. And that's, of course, something that right now, this is a skill. This is a human skill to create these inputs to the render in such a way that what comes out is going to be a nice looking image. So it's an art. That's why they call themselves 3D artists. But for these industrial purposes, we don't care whether the image is nice or not. We care about some predictive power of the simulation. So as long as we have essentially inputs that are in some way representative of, what the texture of the road can be, like what the geometry of light sources around the road and so on. Like if we have models of all these things, we can then start seeing this. But it will be a big modeling or data question. And this idea of, so these generative networks, like one popular approach is these, GANs, generative transversal networks, where you let some generator generate something, and then discriminator tries to discriminate, and it goes in the loop until the discriminator is fooled by what the generator produces. And what people are actually doing today is they're actually inserting a rendering system in the generator process, because by that, you're actually very much regularizing the whole problem, because like you are making sure that whatever comes out of the generator is a consistent image, because it's generated according to the rules of how light behaves. So instead of trying to make a generator that produces the final image, you are actually doing a generator, or trying to construct a generator that's learning how to produce inputs to the rendering system, so that the rendering system then produces an image that is unrecognizable from the root. And this, as a regularization, this works like a charm. So all of the systems that are trying to, like the current systems that are trying to recover reflectance, illumination, and everything from just a single image, they're using rendering as regularization. All of it. Because otherwise, there's so much ambiguity that otherwise you.
Are there any more questions? If it's not the case, then thank you very much for your presentation. This is also Kiranek, and this is also our MeetUp virtual validation. And thank you very much for coming and joining the discussion. Last information, there is some food remaining, so take or eat whatever you will, and see you next time. Thank you very much for coming.